Again, thank you for coming to this webinar. I'm pleased to be part of the Sports Psychology Initiative from SDUIS. I train there. I train with Bob Niederfer in the use of the TACE. And Dr. Christina Vasari, who's been so kind to invite me to this program, has been my mentor for many, many years. I would like this to be as interactive as possible, so feel comfortable in unmuting and asking me a question. If you want to put your videos on so I can see you, if not, that's up to you. But please, let's make this interactive. I've looked over the names. I don't recognize many. Maybe you've not been in one of my webinars before, but I am a licensed psychologist and have been in practice for 35 years. And my specialty, in addition to counseling, has been performance and sports psychology. And we will be joined by Mark Glicini, who is a member of the Premier Lacrosse League. I thought we were going to have some highlights of Mark here. I've known Mark for a little bit more than a year now and have done a little work with him. And he has been so kind to join us and give us some, information from the perspective of being a professional athlete. As the credits are rolling, give you a little background of my experiences. I'm mostly known for my work with golfers because I've done about 3 years on the Golf Channel with Michael Breed and see a number of PGA Tour players and LPGA Tour players. And I'm currently consulting with Rutgers University's men's golf, their Big Ten, and I help them with recruiting. So all the members that have been recruited by the head coach, I work with them and give them mental skills assessment, and just got off the coach on the phone with the coach a little while ago and be working with them again this year. My plan for today is to give you some background information on how I perform as a sports psychologist. And I'm going to work you through the 3 basic areas that I use, which is, mind mechanics, then being able to reduce stress impact on performance. And then the third area is spirituality. Mark has joined us. Mark?
How are you, Dr. Nick? Thank you so much for having me.
I'm glad you could participate with us. We're just giving some background now, show them some of the highlights of your experience as a professional athlete, and eventually you'll be able to give them some more information about utilizing some of the things that we're going to be speaking about today. So going over the basic plan for today, the goals are to tell you a little bit about mind mechanics, what I would describe as stress management, and spirituality. When I engage with an athlete, and clearly people will have the opportunity to work with, to a greater or lesser degree, but my program is about 3 years long for what I would describe as optimal performance. What I've highlighted here right now are some of the aspects of the test of attentional and interpersonal style. Those of you who don't know it, I would highly recommend, if you're an athlete, have someone assess you with this assessment. If you're a professional, mental coach, sports psychologist in the field, if you haven't used the test of attentional and interpersonal style, I would highly recommend it. For those of you who are not familiar with it, most people are not aware then that you may have 20 or so mental skills. This is just kind of a brief overview of the number of the areas that are assessed by the test of attentional and interpersonal style. Mark played at Yale. I worked with Yale's lacrosse team for a season, and we used the assessment, and what we're able to do is come up with taking a look at each one of these 20 factors, and then we broke it down into offense and defense, and then also goalies and face-off. This is a brief example of the scores. So those of you who are familiar with the TACE, this is not new to you. Those of you who have not seen this before, basically what we do is we assess the skill set, and then in the first portion of my training, where I do diagnostics, we will be able to assess these aspects. And then we set up very specific skill training, mental skills training for each of these areas. And then we become sport specific and position specific in looking at things like attentional shifting, factors that are distracting. To some extent, you want to be able to be somewhat distracted to make sure you're seeing the entire field in open sports, and in closed sports such as golf or gymnastics. We don't want you to become distracted very much at all. So by using the assessment, we can tell which areas you need to have highlighted and train your skills in. And then there are very specific techniques, which we're going to go over in a little while. Mark, would you like to comment at all about your experience with the TACE?
Absolutely. And 2 years ago, when I first met Dr. Nick, I left his office and I started focusing on my awareness more and more. And I had a breakout year in the Premier Lacrosse League, and I owe a bit of gratitude, a lot of gratitude to Dr. Nick for making me focus on my awareness. And it's such a simple thing. However, as Dr. Nick will get into, we attentionally shift elsewhere all the time. And I've been working on little mind mechanics myself in order to enhance my concentration through concentration grids, focusing on my awareness, becoming more mindful. Luckily, I had a high awareness score, but this also, I used it as an opportunity to challenge myself and to challenge those around me to not only become a better player myself, but a better teacher of it and a better teammate to those around me. So thank you, Dr. Nick.
Thanks, Mark. The test is called the Test of Attentional and Interpersonal Style, TAIS, by Dr. Robert Nidifer. Now, the interesting aspects about this testing is that it does measure where your attention is, and there's a very specific sequence that you go through depending upon what the sport is. I'll get into that in a little while. So the first portion of my work with any athlete is that they will take the test and then we'll do a debriefing. And at the end of that, we'll have a very specific plan, which we'll give you some examples of as we go through the scores. This is what's called the mental aspects, mental functioning portion for athletes. And we have norms for NBA, NCAA, and at this point I have norms of very, very high performing lacrosse players. So without all the specifics of the scores here, we can talk about that if you have any questions. Now, one of the things that we always look at is how performance is affected by the way in which we think and what emotions might influence our performance. So this is a PET scan. It's a positron emission tomography scan, and it tells us what's happening under pressure. So if we were to take a look at the TACE, and if I were to find high anxiety scores, I would then know that part of what's happening with the athlete under pressure is that the left side of the brain would be heating up. You can't feel that because there's no heat receptors in your brain. But the very first thing that goes away when your brain heats up like this is the ability to analyze data. I think analysis might be pretty important. And in open sports where you're making decisions very quickly, you have to be able to regulate shifting of your attention and executive functionings. You have to be able to stop yourself from going in one direction and go in another direction. So part of the reason that I'm drawn to working with athletes is to look at their executive functioning, because there's a high correlation between high performance in sport and high performance in business. When we see high anxiety scores, we know that something like this is actually taking place. So when we start developing a plan, we need to identify when the anxiety is going to occur. If there's anticipatory anxiety before you actually get onto the field, if it's performance anxiety, it's starting to interfere with you when you're actually performing. And if it's somatic anxiety, we have physiological responses. Now, in this example, where the brain is heating up and the ability to analyze data is affected initially, it also affects muscle groups. So in muscles where you have to tense and relax, we need to be able to do that in a very appropriate sequencing. Individuals that become anxious, their muscle groups will tense up in both directions, so that will modify your ability to be agile, to be quick, to perform strength and power executions in your sport. Mark, would you like to address anything about anxiety and how it might be affecting performance?
Absolutely. And I would say, especially in high pressure situations, big games, when this platform and there's a lot of thousands of people around, and my heart rate is through the roof, it feels like this is where this is really important for me. And something that I do to tackle it, before, during a national anthem, I'll do a quick ABC, which is what are the three things that I can focus on when I know my heart rate is going to be through the roof. That way I can anticipate it. And those are kind of my cues to get back external rather than become too internal and get clouded by a storm of thoughts. I really focus on keeping things simple in my mind so that when I do have higher anxiety and a higher heart rate, I'm able to make things more simple for myself and execute at a higher level.
Anxiety has a physiological basis. There's a good example of that. Heart rate and heart rhythm actually change. We'll talk a little bit about heart rhythm as the as my performance, my presentation goes forward. But one of the things that produces anxiety is being concerned about the outcome. Now, we always want athletes, at least initially, to be focused mostly on where your attention is in the process. So you can see performance from low to high. Some of you are familiar with the Yerkes-Dodson law. I take liberties with being able to draw this to make it a little bit easier to understand the zone of optimal functioning. That's my responsibility in helping athletes get to the highest level. And you can see that in the first section of the graph is arousal levels, want to be psyched up. We can see that on the continuum, if that turns into anxiety, based upon your concern about the outcome, anxiety increases, performance drops off. So the task is to find out where one's mind is at the time of execution. And in attentional shifting, part of what Mark was speaking about, that's actually what the TACE is measuring. Where's your attention at the time of execution, and can you shift your attention back and forth in a very quick way? I'll go over this very briefly. I'd like to see a show of hands, although I'm not going to be able to see that, I'm sure. Some of you may believe in muscle memory. There's no such thing as muscle memory. This is an example of what people used to believe muscle memory was stored, and this is an example of a neuron that's been cut in half, and this yellow area here is where the electrical impulses are coming from your brain and then eventually getting down to your muscles. The green area is what's called myelin. The thicker the myelin, the thicker the insulation. Before it was found that myelin was really insulating the neuron, which would then affect the speed of the electrical activity, which would then translate into execution at high rates and be able to become more agile, stronger, and be able to shift directions. This now is myelin, which is increasing the insulation, so the memory is not stored here. A simple example I always give is if you want to know if muscle memory exists, cut off your head, see how much you remember. So all memory is actually stored in your brain, but the speed with which it's going to get to the muscles is affected by the myelin. This is where myelin is growing. Myelin takes about 6 weeks to grow. You can see it's growing in this direction and that direction. And this occurs when you fail at execution, and then you increase the probability of performance by reacting to the failure with the corrective response. We'll talk a little bit about micro movements later in some of the training, and that's a much more effective way. This is from the book, The Talent Code. I'd highly recommend that book to you as you'll hear some of the books that I'm going to refer you to. This is my explanation of optimal performance. And so this section is really what's based upon the TACE data. I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But basically what I'm looking at are values and personality factors that then affect your intention. I've given the example in my other webinars that you've read a paragraph and don't remember what you've read. If I asked you to read a new paragraph and identify 2 key points, you'd read that paragraph very differently because the intention or your purpose will drive your attention to then start this whole sequence. So your intention drives your attention. If you're intending to be a high-level performer, it's not enough to have the intention. You have to have some specific goals in mind. You have to have specific performances and specific training in mind. Your intention will drive your attention, which will then get into Nidifer's model, which will then eventually move you out into optimal performance. So I always look at values and personality factors that are influencing your attention. You don't get up each morning and say, should I be honest or loyal? Your intention, which is subconscious, will drive your attention so that you can make decisions without becoming aware of it. Your execution and performance is like that as well. Mark?
One quote that has really helped me in this area that Dr. Nick has brought up is the probability of the outcome you want increases when you let go of the need to have it. This has forced me to focus on my change of direction, my speed from a physical standpoint, and then my effort and my communication, right, with my teammates. Those are things that are in my control. And Dr. Nick, one question that I have for you is talking about intention being subconscious. Is it possible that through repetition throughout the day and in your training that you can teach your subconscious to be more intentional in the ways that you want?
It's kind of an interesting, question about, whether it's conscious or not, right? So you have to start off with consciousness, right, to identify what you don't know. And then over a period of time, you're going to see that you're not really paying attention. Your subconscious mind directs that. So you have to set up a goal of becoming intentional, first of all. That's what I would say. This is a simple model of Niederfer's, a simple example of Niederfer's model with a golfer. And so you can see that he talks about external, internal focus, and broad external and narrow external, and broad internal and narrow internal processes of attention. Now, the reason this is for golfers, you don't see the ball and hit the ball in golf, but when you're in lacrosse or when you're in soccer or in open sports where people are trying to inhibit you, most of the performance is played in an external way. Observations of what's going on in a broad perspective and a narrow perspective, back and forth, but golf, you don't do that. Golf, you gather the information, bring your attention inside, analyze the data, narrow your attention down and execute. You cannot go from analyzing to performing. So those two red arrows are helping you see you cannot be directing your attention here in golf. You need to narrow your attention, finally execute. In lacrosse, it's played mostly up here.
As much as I would love to be proactive in lacrosse, I find myself being more reactive most of the time. One of the things that I do in my preparation for a game is use imagery while I'm watching film and before I go to sleep. That way I can kind of already mentally rehearse what's going on. That way I can make these snap judgments when the game does start.
There was a question I'll just address very briefly because it had to do with the growth of myelin. Yes, myelin grows after failure in correction. And so micro movements are very important in terms of being able to learn. So if you take a look at Brazilian soccer players, one of the reasons why they're so effective with their footwork is because they learn to use footwork and fail and correct it very quickly when they were young. The ball used in futsal does not bounce, so you have to be able to use your feet. In American soccer, where frequently futsal was not the beginning, you can kick the ball down the other end of the field, and you're not really utilizing those micro movements as effectively. I'm going to move through the next couple of slides very quickly, just because we have so much content to go over. This is a before and after of a training of a golfer that I work with. Using the taste scores, and we can see that at a point in time when his analysis was very, very low, he became more analytical. We can see that he's actually removed some of his internal distractibility from being self-critical down to a very low number. So it's a good example that we can use training by identifying 20 mental skills in the diagnostics, then we start the prescriptive aspects of this, and then we start doing the training. This is my model of intention. We've briefly gone over that. I'm going to move through these things. They're very simple because we have so much content. These are the examples of, in the mind mechanics aspect, that we set up goals that are outcome. That's a larger, broader perspective. Performance goals are always measurable. Process goals are essential in order to get to your performance goals and to the outcome goals. Again, this presentation was to identify the 3 key factors in optimal performance, and the first one are mind mechanics. There's just too many for us to be reviewing today.
Dr. Nick, what would you say is a good starting point for someone that really wants to work on their mind mechanics and doesn't have access to the test?
I would set very specific goals and then look at factors that are essential in performance. So let's look at one very specific thing that you need to do. So if you're using your legs for any sport, you know, whether it's football, whether it's track, whether it's volleyball, there's something that you're going to do first at the lower portion of your extremities. Focus on exploding. Focus on whether you're moving from the right to the left, and focus on a sensation of what you need to experience in order to move in that direction, in the opposite direction. Focus on one very specific micro movement, and then you can start integrating some of the things I'm using here right now. So identify the very first action that you have to do in whatever execution, was swinging a bat, catching a ball, throwing it, or running. Focus on a very small group of micro muscles and just imagine what that sensation would feel like if you were going to actually do it. That would be proprioception. You can actually feel it. And the more you train feeling this without actually moving your muscle, the more you're going to be able to actually accentuate that and increase the speed of that aspect of your performance.
That was so helpful. One of the things that I use in my imagery of that proprioception is when I'm going out to play defense on an individual, I have to match their pace. So something that I find myself doing even when I'm sleeping and I'm using imagery is I'm twitching my hips because I have to flip my hips open back and forth. So that's one of the specific micro movements I focus on as a defender, and that really drives home to me.
That's great. I'm going to go over very quickly some of these basic examples. So imagery is external, where you imagine what a video camera would see about your performance. So imagine what a video camera would see. Internally, what you would see. So if you're running down the field and if you're going to fire on the goal, what would that look like to you as you're getting closer? And then proprioception is the actual felt experience of what is occurring during the time of that activity. Eyes closed drills are very, very effective. 50% of your brain is devoted to vision. Now, I'm not suggesting that you're running down the field with your eyes closed. I'm suggesting that if you're using a lacrosse stick or if you're swinging a baseball bat with your eyes closed, take a micro movement section, stand in front of a mirror, and take the starting and the ending of that micro movement, and then move your body in that position with your eyes closed, stand in front of the mirror, open your eyes, and take a snapshot. You will then be using your proprioception about where to start the swing and where to stop it in a micro movement. By using your mirror of very discrete aspects of your performance, you're going to train your brain to feel what that sensation would feel like in a very accurate way. That's a very important piece of training. Close your eyes. 50% of your brain is devoted to vision. You will increase your proprioceptive experience. Weight shifting, any of those examples, by closing your eyes, practice in front of a mirror, the beginning and the ending of that micro movement, open your eyes and take a snapshot.
I love that, Dr. Nick. And when you're focusing on those micro movements, you indirectly, as a byproduct, are not focusing on the outcome anymore, right? About finishing or whether the shot goes
That's
in or it
right.
doesn't, right? You're focusing on the micro thing, which takes you further away from the outcome, and that's exactly where you want to be.
Right. That'll be the process focus, and particularly in when we look at the process aspects of your goal setting as well. Before I get into stress management, does anybody have any questions? Again, this is just a cursory review of some of the mind mechanics. Anybody have any questions, any comments?
Dr. Nick, one question that came up in the group chat was, do you need the failure to increase myelin growth?
The answer to that is yes. So when you look at um, when growth is occurring in the myelin, it's a result of having failed and corrected it. And so that's why when you look at what happened with the Brazilian soccer players, there was continuous failing at micro movements to begin with. But absolutely, that's essential. Failure is important in another way because you'll never know what your abilities are until you actually get to the highest level of your performance and failing at that. So pushing yourself in failure is a really important piece, both in myelin growth and in terms of finding out what your potentials are. The reason I bring up stress management in the second section of my training with high performing athletes, stress is cumulative and progressive. So it continuously adds. So whether you're failing or whether you need to take additional training, there's going to be aspects that's going to continuously stress you. Stress is anything that moves the individual away from equilibrium. COVID has really increased a great deal of stress, but you need to be aware of what the factors are that are stressing you. And most of what's occurring is occurring in our mind. So the example that no one speaks to you more than you do, based upon the research that we have 80,000 thoughts a day. You're not aware of what you're thinking of, but people that are stressed and are anxious are having between 60 to 70% of those thoughts now negative. So you can imagine, let's look at golfers. If you're on the golf course for 4.5 hours and you have 3,000 thoughts, it's a lot of thoughts. And if 60 to 70% of those things are negative, if you're not performing well, you can imagine what's going to happen with the outcome. So take a look at what you're thinking about on a daily basis and see whether or not you can change your mind about that. The human span of concentration is only 10 minutes. Try to go 10 minutes without having a disruptive thought. I don't think it's going to go very far. It doesn't have to be a negative thought, but it's going to take you off task. And so you have to be able to bring yourself right back to task. Thinking is like breathing. If you don't pay attention to your breathing, you're just going to breathe. If you don't pay attention to what you're thinking, you're just going to think. Just like you can hold your breath, and just like you can breathe quicker, you can do the same thing with your thoughts. You can hold a thought, you can eliminate the thought, you can eliminate your breathing. But the metaphor is that if you just let your breathing go, you won't pay attention to it. If you let your thinking go, you may continuously have negative thoughts and not pay attention to them and interrupt that. Mark, any comments you want to make about your thinking when you're playing at a professional level?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you. And what this was my first problem and it really made me pay attention to mind mechanics is the fact that I felt from a metaphorical standpoint, roughly 7 years ago, I was heading into a Ivy League championship game while I was a player at Yale. We were playing at Brown, and I felt like an ocean of negative thoughts. It was much higher than 60% at the time for me. And this really made me focus on paying attention to my thoughts the same way that I do with my breath and become completely mindful of them, not trying to change them per se, but just first becoming aware of them. That way I could navigate through them. And I use the metaphor ocean of negativity because it really did feel that way. I had no control of the water and it was really overwhelming. Right. And I worked with a mental coach, Brian Kane, at the time. And what he helped me do is become more external, focus on the task at hand rather than what ifs or if this possibly happens. One of the questions I find myself even to this day from that overwhelming experience was, can I control that? I mean, that is such an important question that we can ask ourselves. And I was able to, in that time, play one of the best games of my career at Yale because I was able to understand that thinking is like breathing and I can control it and pay attention to it in the way which is beneficial.
Great. We have a question here. Can I do 2 college intramural sports and reach peak performance in both? I want to do table tennis and track. I might do diving instead of track. And the answer is, can you reach your peak performance? Yeah, peak performance, it doesn't mean that you have to do this 24/7. You don't even know what your optimal performance is until you push yourself till you get to that point. The issue about cross training, and that's not necessarily what's going on in these sports, but cross training, I think, is really very, very, very important. When you learn how to use yourself well, it's not going to matter whether you're doing it just today or for a season, because in my introduction, is that it's always about execution and excellence. It's never about winning. So if you're focusing on how to use yourself well by using appropriate mind mechanics, training yourself at a very high level, and eventually we get to the next portion of this after stress management, we'll talk about optimal performance based upon the way in which you're processing it in a value system. So let me go back to that last slide. I always talk about feelings as being overrated. Feelings don't always tell you the truth. But part of the problem with this is that when you even look at what confidence is, there's a controversy, certainly in my mind, that confidence is not a good predictor of performance anyway. And when you look at the definition of confidence, that has two basic qualities: what you believe about your abilities to do, your skill set, and what you feel. Beliefs and feelings don't always tell us the truth. So don't pay a lot of attention to feelings at times, and don't pay a lot of attention to what you're believing unless they're the truth. The glass is neither half full nor half empty. It's 4 ounces in an 8 ounce glass. That's the truth. You can argue anyway that it's a full or empty, or that your feelings are telling you the truth, but eventually there is a truth. Make sure you're paying attention to the truth. That will help you manage your stress more effectively as well. In being able to manage stress effectively, we look at what's called the emotional mind and the rational mind. And I just given you examples that your emotions aren't always telling you the truth, and either is what you're telling yourself or what you're thinking or believing. Wisdom is the blending of being able to use the information that you're gathering from your emotional reactions or your emotional experiences, your sensitivity, and the rational part, and then being able to modify just paying attention to one or the other and being able to see what the truth is. To me, wisdom is the application of knowledge in a different way than perhaps the way you were doing it at first. When you see what the truth is, that's a good example of the wise mind taking over. Mark, I'm sure you've had some examples where emotions may have affected your performance.
Oh, absolutely. And you've used two lines that I have written down is learn how to use yourself well in answering Helen's question, and then application of knowledge in the right way. And I think something that's helped me at the professional level is making sure I am intentional with my actions. You talked about it before, very early on in the slides, but being intentional with your actions is probably the best thing you can do if you want to reach high performance, closer to peak performance, is making sure your application of knowledge is learning how to use it in the right way, effectively for you, and not trying to do, like even reading that question about trying to do both at a very high level. Just make sure that your consistent activity is falling in line in which it comes to a crest and not a trough.
Great. Emotions can occur in two ways. Clearly, it can occur in a spontaneous way. If you're walking through the woods and a bear jumps out, you don't have to be thinking about that. You become frightened. But emotions can occur because of the way in which you think about things. So if I asked you now to imagine something that's juicy in your mouth, like a peach or an orange, an apple, if you try to imagine that as clearly as you can, you'll start to salivate. Because psychologists are weird dudes, we measure the amount of saliva when you imagine a piece of fruit in your mouth, and we measure the amount of saliva when there's actually a piece of fruit there. And they're exactly the same, which means that your mind can trick your body into reacting in a physiological way, even when it's not true. That's what happens with emotions at times. So fears and anxieties are based upon sometimes distortions of what the truth is. So we'll keep going over that. So as a performer, you have to look at the truth. If you're anxious or frightened before a competition, some degree of anxiety is reasonable because you don't know how you're going to perform. But if you're creating a distortion in your mind that you won't perform at a high level, or you're not good enough, or you might not be able to make the play, those reactions based upon your thoughts will start to fire to the autonomic system and inhibit your performance, as I showed you before in the example of the brain.
If there's anything I've learned from Dr. Nick, it's to search and desire and work towards the truth, self-efficacy, and this alignment of body, mind, and brain, and figuring out a way to align it that makes you most effective is so important. Dr. Nick, we have a question from Julian, and the fact that Julian went over some videos by Dr. Angela Duckworth on grit. Are there ways to use mental skills and visualization to increase grit?
Julian, thanks for joining in again. I think this might be your third webinar, but thanks for being here. And the answer to that is yes. I mean, I think when certainly if you've listened to Dr. Duckworth's description of grit in her first evaluation, she said it was an inherent quality. It looked like it was like you wouldn't be able to develop that. But are there ways that you can do this? And I would say yes. In her second book, in Passion and Perseverance, I think she talks more about, being able to become more gritty by being able to imagine and perceive yourself in a different way. So the most important piece of grit for me, in addition to passion and perseverance, is that you have a low need for positive reinforcement. Now, it used to be used in imagery that you would see yourself holding, the trophy. I never use outcome goals to do that. But what I do use are performance goals and process goals to get yourself there. So, for example, if you're not performing at your highest level, or even if you are performing at your highest level, we're not looking for the outcome as the positive reinforcement. We're looking at what it would look like if you were persevering and you weren't giving up in spite of the fact that you weren't successful. What would that model look like? Since I know that Julian is a golfer, that this is not about winning the trophy. It is about what you might see Tiger Woods do. If he misses a shot, what does he do at the very next shot? You can see his focus. You could see his intensity. You could see his relaxation. You could see his breathing. So the images that we would want are process focused goals, things that you're doing in the moment that show you how you handle adversity. That's what I would suggest.
I love that answer, Dr. Nick. Something that I use in terms of low need of positive reinforcement is the metaphor of, are you a wildfire or are you a candle? And when you have a bad thing go wrong, are you blown out easily by oxygen, or do you use oxygen to extend your wildfire? Now, both is using adversity or the low need for positive reinforcement to become more focused. What a great idea. Become more focused, get in the trenches even after something bad happens. That's something I definitely use, and I constantly have myself, even as a reminder with the word wildfire, to dig deeper.
Well, Joe, you must have known where I was going to, so we finally got to grit. And I would say that this is a really essential piece in being able to manage stress, because what's happened is that the stressor actually draws you closer to what you need to do. And this becomes part of the mindset. And what we're going to talk about briefly here is mindset. And then we're going to talk about the obstacle is the way. So several books I would add to, what we were talking about before, is The Talent Code, and certainly Mindset by Carol Dweck, and Grit by Dr. Angela Duckworth. And then we're going to be looking at the obstacle is the way. So a mindset is about the way in which you're going to approach things. Before your performance, before your practice, before anything that you do, you should be anticipating how you're going to do that. And looking at every moment of every day is the opportunity to excel. Every decision that you make, every execution of what you do as a performer, whether it's the way you move your body, whether it's the way you breathe. Um, Years ago, I think you may have heard of a guy named Nick Saban at Alabama. And Nick focused on the process and not the outcome. And a colleague of mine was down there when Saban was really paying a lot of attention to that. And he went to lunch with the team, and all the players were talking about the process of eating. Like, what is the process of eating? Selection of foods, the way in which you eat, putting your your fork down in between taking a bite, not speaking with your mouth open, focusing on everything that they did. And that year is one of the years they won one of their national championships. So we would talk about that in terms of a mindset. How do you go into everything that you do, whether it's your studies, whether it's your friendships, whether it's your exercise or eating? Make sure that there is a purpose to what you're doing, and you're doing it in a very open-minded way. Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that comes to mind in this regard is not only preparation, but little victories. On my podcast, I had Brody Merrill join me, who's arguably the best defenseman that's ever played the game. And something that we talked about is the word during, During. What do you do during the day? Not just at your training session, not just when the lights are on, not when you're in the meeting, right? And the high pressure starts to come about, but those little victories that you can find throughout your day. And we focus on that word during, because if you can find those little victories, that's where the advantages happen. I've become a firm believer in these little victories and making sure something as simple as if I'm watching a TV show, I'm going to stretch out my hip flexors while I'm doing it. Right. And it's making the most of the time. Right. That was a perfect example that Dr. Nick used with Nick Saban's team in the process of eating food. But it's really true. I find in being around peak performers like Brody Merrill, you really search for those little victories, right? And you kind of make a big deal over the little things and find little wins that you can have throughout your day.
Um, let's see, there's a question here. Thank you. Will we be able to view your PowerPoint presentation later to refer back to with our notes? I'll try to make sure I do that. Just remind me as we're going through this. I would move forward after a setback by refocusing on micro movements. Absolutely. Very good. Okay, any obstacle is the way. What happened here? Is the PowerPoint up? I can't see this.
Yes, it is.
Okay, I apologize. Any obstacle is the way. You know, it's a great book, and it's talking about you know, adversity as things that you're kind of drawn into. And clearly, you know, when we're faced with COVID, I mean, when I've spoken with a number of groups, both teams and you know, corporate settings, this is an opportunity to excel. It's an opportunity to find a creative way to solve the problems that you're faced with. I mean, obviously, because you're not able to train in the same way you did before, either with your team or with your trainers. You can't even get into the gym. So now this adversity is an opportunity to be very creative and to see things in a very different manner. I would highly recommend Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is a Way. So those 3 or 4 books that I've mentioned to you are exceptional.
I'm reading right now, right along with Obstacle is the Way, is Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. And no matter where you go, their ego is. And it all falls under the same idea that can you be in the present moment and focus on what you can control, almost from a Stoic philosophy, rather than focus on the what ifs and those things that are outside of your control. From the words of Dr. Gilbert, every problem brings about one of 2 F's. You can either become frustrated or fascinated. And if you choose to find the silver lining and become fascinated, you'll see that the obstacle is the way, and you become better rather than bitter.
Let's take some of that, you know, the kind of facing adversity and looking at being in the moment. And so when I was talking before about the use of a mirror with your eyes closed and slow motion movements is a very, very effective way. This is now going to help us transform into the next section of the presentation of being in the moment. It's very, very critical that if you're going to learn about your performance is to slow things down. When you're doing micro movements and if you're using eyes closed and you're slowing down any movement that you can, clearly you can't tumble and do that very easily. So when working with gymnastics, that's a very hard one for them to get, except that they can just use their imaginations. But being in the moment, being able to sense the experiences that you're having, even with your breathing, or even as you're running in very slow motion or walking, that will really help you manage your attention. This is an example. So some of the work I do, actually every athlete that I work with will be hypnotized at one point in time. And the reason that I'm using this now is to help us understand that we have so much more control over our mind-brain-body connection. So if you take a look at some of these images, you can see that we can actually modify responses in the brain by using hypnosis. We can use this in terms of meditation. We can reduce pain. There are many things that we can do as a result of being able to control our mind-body interaction. This is an example of a pain rating, and this is actually physically responsive as measured by the MRI. Here, we're now inducing pain by imagining what pain would be like at a 5 and imagining what pain would be like with a 1 rating. That's all created by your brain. In hypnosis, we can focus our intention and our attention in a very, very different way. I use it with every athlete at least once. Some athletes have been hypnotized 4 or 5 times. An example of anesthesia. Anesthesia, this is what anesthesia would look like. This is the brain by using hypnotic state. This is normal wakefulness. So you can see that we can actually modify hypnotic states, modify experiences with attention, pain, and being able to move your mind and brain into working collaboratively by using an altered state of consciousness. Those of you who might be psychologists, you might be familiar with HeartMath. This is a great piece of equipment. Um, for those of you who are not, and if you want to be able to purchase this, I'm not trying to sell anything, there's a great little device that clips to your ear, and then on your iPhone, Inner Balance is the app. It's a very, very effective way of being able to regulate your heart rhythm by breathing and putting your brain and your heart into what's called a coherent state by doing a very specific mechanism. I want to help you understand that in my work as I'm a scientist, that after I do the assessments, we do some, basic training in mind mechanics. We move into managing stress more effectively, which is eventually going to lead us now into what I would describe as the highest level of performance, and that becomes the integration of spirituality. We're going to move past some of this because the time's going by. Anything you want to say, Mark, before I move into the next section?
Sure. Just to put a bookend to the stress management side of things, I had the privilege to sit down with a Navy SEAL who's a character coach for us on the San Diego SEALs, the professional team that I play for, and we were actually hooked up to a monitor to our earlobe for heart rate variability. And the quick point about it is he did have us do a breathing exercise that he does with all his Navy SEALs. And what we found is when we really thought about a leader or something that we disagreed with or something that really was heart-wrenching for us in our life, whether it be a relationship, we had little to no coherence. And heart rate variability is something that we should definitely pay attention to more and more, because it can be damaged by different things and by lack of sleep, by travel, all these different things that have factors to it. If you just pay attention to your heart rate variability and finding coherence, there's a lot of productivity to be had.
Thank you, Mark. It's heart rate and heart rhythm. And so in what's called the coherent state, you'll see that the rhythm of the heart and the rhythm of the brain come together. That closely comes to what happens when you're in flow states. There's a question here, which is a great tie-in to the next section. The slow motion is interesting. I've always thought that real-time visualization was more beneficial. What I would say about the slow motion, and this could add to the experience of what's called phenomenology. The experience of your experience. What's the experience of moving your arms slowly? What's the experience of moving your legs slowly? What's the experience of shifting your weight slowly? As you do that, you're going to become so much more aware of things you've never become aware of before. I was working with a basketball player, and one of the techniques was to be on the foul line and make 10 in a row with your eyes closed, and eventually moving back, to the 3-point line in different aspects, different areas on the court. And so as we were getting him ready to start working with his eyes closed, we did slow motion movements, and he actually found the very specific point at which his elbow should be in a portion of his body close to his body. He never felt that before. So I would urge you to have experiences with slow motion movements and become more aware of each aspect of weight shifting as a good example, or movement of your arms or your elbows in different areas. That's a really critical piece. If you could turn off your microphone if you're outside, that'd be great. I'm bringing this up in terms of what's called phenomenology, which is your own experience with your experience. And that's a portion of what goes on in what might describe as spirituality. Now, most people think of spirituality from a religious perspective. So I would talk, if someone who has their microphone on outside, if you could just turn that off, that'd be great. Thank you. And so I'm going to introduce this by talking about faith. Now, when I bring up faith, immediately when I ask a person what they have faith in, the first thing that they say, you mean like faith in God? So we can talk about God. Spirituality can be God. Faith as a process is a belief that has no proof and no doubt. So you can trust your performance because you have the skills. Trust is based upon proof. It's based upon what's happened in the past. Faith has no proof and there's no doubt, and it's future oriented. If you have faith in your ability to perform, you're going to take your performance to the very next level that you can't do if you're only trusting certain skill sets. Now, faith is not talked about frequently. We can talk about it in terms of God, but we can also talk about it as a process of a belief that transcends anything you've ever experienced in terms of your performance. If it's trust-based, it's only based upon what you've done. It's not based upon what you're going to be able to do. Mark?
I mean, it's so important. This is a main driver for me. I've talked about in the mind mechanics stage, the simple fact of just becoming more aware of my thinking, similar to my breathing. And I heard Dabo Sweeney from Clemson speak about faith over fear, because they both come from the same belief system, like Dr. Nick was talking about, no proof, no doubt. But this has given me reason. When I get internal and I do imagery, I do find a deeper feeling for and reason as to why I'm doing something. And I think if I was to point out to the reason why I am able to continue to take my game to a higher level, I would say it's not just the skill development, it's the spirituality aspect of it, and the fact that I have extreme faith that the future is going to be better for me. And although I have no proof of it, I'm going to continue to believe in it because I know I felt it on a deep level of what it can do for me in the present moment just by thinking about it, future oriented.
The integration of spirituality, a high level performance, is the last thing that I do with an athlete. I mean, I don't mean that we stop working, but it is the last in a sequence of the things that I've presented. So there's diagnostics, and then there's mind mechanics. There's a further reduction of stress, because stress will um, impact performance at such a high level. And when people are finally able to get themselves to the point of transcending, which means that they've gone beyond their um, execution of skills and whatever they can do from a physiological perspective. They've managed stress, they've taken care of their bodies in all sorts of ways in terms of training and practice. They have reduced the impact that stress has, and the next highest level will be this process of spirituality. The book is called Sport and Spirituality. It's a great, great book. I would not recommend it for you unless you're going to spend a lot of time, because it becomes what's called very existential. It is a very specific way of thinking, and it moves you into the highest level of performance because it requires your thinking and your being with yourself in a very, very different way than just looking at what you're doing. It looks at who you are. It looks at your experience of being in the world. It looks at your experience of being in a relationship with whomever, your coach, your family, your parents. Uh, and it looks at things that go way beyond what you can learn just because someone's teaching them to you. It requires a moving away from traditions of understanding who you are. It's hard to explain, but I'll tell you that when I get there with athletes, it's amazing when they start to have this awakening.
Dr. Nick, to add to that is facts fade, stories stick. And here's a story that is just true. And I don't have I'm not going to be too emotional about it. But over the past year, I've really gone deeper and deeper into my faith. And I play in the Premier Lacrosse League. I'm a fourth-year professional lacrosse player going into his fifth. And last year, I won a Teammate of the Year award. I was a nominee for Short Stick Defensive Player of the Year. And I joined Team USA all in the last year. And I think it has a lot to do with the topic we're on top of right now. I wrote an article called Am I Really Crazy? It's on the Premier Lacrosse League website if you want to check it out. And it has nothing to do with my feeling of being crazy. It has everything to do with my feeling of undying commitment, which has become part of my spirituality and faith-based execution on the field. My skill development is as high as it's ever been. My mind mechanics are I'm very aware, I'm very mindful of where I am in my thought life. But to go above and beyond and to receive these words of iconic and blocking shots with my back, if you look up what I've done this past year, it has nothing to do other than my faith and the commitment I have along with the faith and spirituality aspect of the sport of lacrosse.
Thank you, Mark, for being so disclosing and sharing. Um, I have worked with a fellowship of Christian athletes, so I'm not embarrassed to speak about my spirituality from a Christian perspective. My spirituality, in addition to being faith-based religious, is also from a very strong training and background in Eastern philosophy, a minor in theology and a minor in philosophy as well. Certainly, we cannot end this without mentioning Dr. Robert Nidafer's work on faith and performance.
Mm-hmm.
So if any of you have listened to Bob last week, he's excellent, and I've learned a lot from him. I would ask you all to read Faith and Performance. It's available by a PDF. You can go online. Bob has been giving that book away since he's written it. And I would urge you to do that. And the answer to the question, is this being recorded? And the answer is yes, it is being recorded. Oh, thank you very much. Those of you who have thanked me. And I appreciate your time. We can take a few more questions. And it's great if you just open up your mics and have an interaction instead of just doing things that I'm reading here. That's fine with me and Mark.
Thank you again for having me on, Dr. Nick. It's been awesome.
My pleasure, Mark.
Hi, Dr. Nick. Thank you again for another great session. Can you expand a little bit more on faith, especially from like a from an atheist point of view without involving God? How does faith play into sports? I know you've talked some about this, but I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on it.
Sure. So when you look at faith as a process, there's a very interesting concept that you're going to believe something that you can't prove. And if you ask yourself, do you have faith in anything? And frequently people will talk about having faith in someone. And let's take a look at that as a child having faith in their parents. And their faith is that they rely on that person as if everything that they say is true and that it's going to come true. As you mature, sometimes you may lose faith in parents and you may lose faith in humanity. But when you look at yourself and you understand that when you have faith, there's not a doubt in your mind that you're going to do whatever it is. I have faith that no matter what I face, I will not give up until I use everything that's available to me. There's not a question in my mind about that. Now, I don't trust my golf swing very often. And I don't have faith that I'm going to perform at a high level in golf because although I enjoy it, it doesn't really move me to use all of my resources at the highest level. But there's never a doubt in my mind that there's something that I have responsible for someone or for myself. There's not a question. There's no doubt. It's transcendent. And I think if you can, what's called indwell, which is really kind of look at the way in which you're thinking and experiencing yourself, there's probably something that you have faith in. Maybe you don't. If you haven't had that experience with your own self, it would be hard for you to have faith in anything else. It is phenomenological. That is, how can you explain your experience with faith? Phenomenology is the study of your experience with your experience. That's what psychological phenomenology is. And for those of you who have not read any works, I would encourage you to start looking at things that transcend. Actually, a lot of the studies now in sports psychology is moving into things that are like this, that are existential in what's called heuristic. So for example, if I asked you to tell me what your experience of loneliness was like, your experience to me would be valuable to understand just your experience. It's not to prove or disprove. This is a study of all people that have experiences with loneliness. It is to help me understand your one's experience. So imagine working with an athlete, and the athlete now is telling you this is what they have faith in and how it's kind of carried them, just as Mark was talking about that. There's nothing that else, we can't bring that to anybody. We have to find that out from them. So what I try to do in my discussions with athletes is help them indwell, move inside themselves, talk about the experience of what it's like to move their body slowly in their training of their performance, and help them develop a greater awareness of what the tension is like or what the relaxation is like. That becomes phenomenology. Faith is based upon your ability to indwell and have the experiences of yourself. I hope that's clear.
That was wonderfully said.
I've got a question if you guys have a second. I'm wondering how much we attribute environment as a factor in regard to optimal performance. I think from my own experiences, I recently retired from fighting professionally in mixed martial arts, and there's a lot of factors that are involved, a lot of things in motion and play, even for those that are, kind of doing all the right things, in regard to, training hard, having involving mental training, etc. What are your guys' thoughts on, environment and when is it the time to change your environment because you've reached your cap as an individual mentally and physically, and maybe now the environment is it's time to look at.
Well, clearly what I would talk about, the impact of that environment is that if we look at the impact of environment at a very early stage in your development, the study was done at NYU, New York longitudinal study, went on for 50 years. And they observed children from 4 weeks after birth until they became 50 years old. And what they were looking at is environmental factors of what was going on within the parent-child relationship. I don't know about the rest of that, but there have been studies post that, and I would look at any of those studies that were taking place. What the research has told us that environment is responsible for 50% of your performance. So, whether it was training at an early age or who trained you, and I haven't seen anything more specifically about that, Evan, but you've encouraged me to take a look at some of the research around that. But I would say it's a 50-50 situation. Since no one ever utilizes all of their resources, I mean, any athlete is only reaching their top level of potential 15% of the time. That's why the Olympics are always amazing to see in the world, everybody reaching the top 15% for 2 weeks from all these different countries. But so I would go back and take a look at when have you executed that, and have you learned something about what was missing? Always look at what's missing. You don't know what you don't know until you try to find out what's missing. Changing the environment may actually help you find out what's missing.
Hi, Dr. Nick and Mark. My name is Dr. Troy Small. Thank you so much for this amazing webinar. I've learned so much. I do have a quick question. Speaking of environment, I'm sure you're very aware that attachment is very important. How can we help our coaches as well as our athletes form a more formidable attachment with each other, especially if the relationship and the environment may be a little bit more adverse, and it's just not a cohesive relationship at the moment? How do you create a more solid, secure attachment between the two?
A great question, Doctor. Thanks for joining in and asking the question. And please help me. So you may be an expert in this. I'm not. But my belief is always about understanding, that the only time that the attachment can actually take place is when there's a great sense of understanding. And we're talking about the empathic process. Now, in order to reach the deepest state of belonging and cohesiveness, understanding is that essential piece. Now, that understanding can only occur through disclosure. And so it is to foster that disclosure between, certainly the coach and the players, and the player and the team itself. I think you can take a look at what happened, with Phil Jackson, with the Bulls, and he talks about, he's a pretty existential guy, and he's using a lot of that basic process of understanding, disclosure, and actual Tao philosophy. That's where I would begin.
That's good. That's powerful. Thank you so much. Just trying to get them to come to a little bit deeper level outside of sports. So I think I'm spot on. Thank you. That helped me so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Thank you.
Shoot, I have a question.
Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Oh, good. Sorry. Okay. Thank you for your webinar. This has been mind blowing. I have so many things that I've been thinking about, but one in particular is that whole spiritual piece. If an athlete has that has acquired that level, are there studies that show that perhaps that helps in a transition from sport to something else?
Sorry, I mean, I'm typing at the same time. I'm a man. I can't do two things at once. And
I'm just wondering about the link.
I'm also dyslexic, so if anybody's correcting my spelling, please be aware of that. So say the last part of your question again, because I did have an answer for it.
It is whether transition is facilitated through.
Yes. Yes, and so certainly I would refer you to Dr. Christina Vasari. You know, because she's an expert in that field, and she's worked with the NBA for years, and she would be able to tell you that much better than I would have to make up an answer, which psychologists do all the time. It sounds like we know what we're talking about. But I would speak with Dr. Christina Vasari, who's responsible for this webinar.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I am speaking with her on a regular basis, so I've got.
Oh, okay. Yeah. She would have the answer, and I learned from her. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Question. My name is Lance Irvin. I was curious to ask about how you said, like, kind of like Nick Saban, I coach basketball. You just focus on the process, It's interesting because you know how at the end of the day, you want to win so bad. So when I'm coaching, if I'm focusing on the process, should I just stay on that play at that particular point in time? Some, you know, like that, or what kind of example could you give me?
The process varies. Is it Lance?
Yes.
Yeah, I would, you know, the process changes. I mean, so for example, when working with a basketball player, and the process of being, let's say, just even on the foul line, right? So at that point, the basket's not going to move, so nobody's going to try and stop you. So where's your attention at that time? Is your attention on the process of breathing? Is the attention on the process of having the ball roll off your fingertips? Is the process, so it's each one of those aspects of your performance that's essential in order for you to be able to do that effectively. That's what I would say. So then, so it could be the mind mechanic of remaining focused and not moving. It could be your attention. It could be the mechanics of what you're learning from you, the coach. So it's always what you have to do in order to take the very next step in the execution of your performance. Okay. Any other questions? My email is drnick@performanceinmind.com. And if you just go on the web, you'll just put in my name, you'll see a couple things. You can find a way to reach out to me.